welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating psychological analysis of Donald Trump, looking at his political persona not through the lens of politics, but through the lens of Jungian psychology. So, this is the huge question at the heart of the source material we're looking at today. And right away, you can see this sets the stage for a very different kind of analysis, one that's less about policy and more about the psyche. All right, Section 1, a psyche and power. The whole argument here is that if you really want to understand Donald Trump, you've got to put politics aside for a minute and look through a different lens, the lens of the human psyche itself. This quote really sets the tone, doesn't it? The idea isn't just about one person's personality. It's about what happens when unresolved inner chaos gets a hold of immense global power. Okay, so how is this labyrinth actually built? Well, let's start with a face we all show the world. Carl Jung had a name for this. He called it the persona. The persona is basically our public mask. And when that mask starts to get fragile, well, it's a huge red flag for deeper issues. The source we're looking at points to a really specific image to illustrate this. Donald Trump, all alone, late at night, firing off posts online. It argues this isn't just about strategy, it's a window into his psyche. Yeah, so the interpretation here isn't one of strength at all. It's seen as an ego that's become totally isolated from the inner self, and it's just desperately screaming for validation from the outside world. This gets us to a really core idea in this analysis, the inflated ego. But here's the twist from a Jungian perspective. An inflated ego isn't strong. It's actually incredibly brittle. So what does that brittle, inflated ego look like in practice? Well, according to this analysis, it gets super fragile. It sees any kind of challenge as a threat of total annihilation. Criticism isn't just criticism, it's persecution. It demands absolute, unquestioning loyalty, and it has to crush any and all dissent. What's so fascinating is how the source reframes this. These aren't just seen as political moves, they're seen as desperate psychological defense mechanisms. Okay, so if the ego is that fragile, how does it hold on? How does it maintain control? The source says it boils down to two key strategies: creating enemies on the outside and building a powerful myth for itself. This brings us to a big concept in psychology: projection. It's a defense mechanism where you take the parts of yourself you can't stand, the things you find unacceptable, and instead of owning them, you pin them on other people. The source argues this is absolutely fundamental to understanding Donald Trump's psyche. It's about turning inner battles into outer wars. And this chart really lays it out, doesn't it? When he makes accusations calling others frauds, the Jungian interpretation is that it's a reflection of his own disowned deceit. Criminals, a projection of his own moral emptiness. Enemies of the people, a way to push his own internal instability onto the outside world. The analysis suggests it's like he's holding up a mirror to his own psyche, but pointing at everyone else. And then there's the myth, the big, simple, seductive myth. I alone can fix it. From a Jungian perspective, this is a classic trap. It's the archetype of the false hero. And the really crucial point here isn't just that this is for the public. According to the source, it's a vital psychological shield, protecting that fragile ego from the truth of its own weaknesses. All right. This is where we go even deeper. We're moving past the ego and into what the source sees as the most volatile and, frankly, dangerous part of this whole equation, what Jung called the shadow. So what is the shadow? It's basically the basement of your unconscious mind. It's where you stuff everything you refuse to admit about yourself: your cruelty, your greed, your lust for power. Now, the analysis says a healthy person tries to face that shadow, to integrate it. But the argument here is that Donald Trump does the exact opposite. He doesn't integrate it, he puts it on stage for the whole world to see. And what does that performance look like? Well, the source points to things like the constant taunting of rivals, these public displays of cruelty, an obsession with humiliating people, and an open, almost gleeful delight in vengeance. And here's the really dangerous part, according to this analysis. When those behaviors get cheered, when they're rewarded with attention, the shadow doesn't just get a voice, it gets amplified. It becomes an addiction that needs a bigger and bigger fix. Jung had a word for this. He compared this state to possession, not by some literal demon, but by these powerful, unconscious forces that just completely overwhelm the conscious ego. This analysis suggests that's why the rhetoric just keeps escalating, why the language gets darker and darker. The unconscious has taken the wheel. Okay, so what? Why does one person's psychology matter on a national scale? This is maybe the most critical argument in the entire source. A leader's psychological state is never just personal. It always, always becomes a collective thing. Jung had this warning that leaders don't actually create darkness out of thin air. They activate the darkness that's already there. They basically give society permission for its own collective shadow to come out and play. The idea here is that when millions of people identify with a leader's wounded ego, they start to take on its psychology, its fears, its enemies, its sense of being persecuted. And the source describes this as a kind of cult dynamic. It starts with a leader's message, "I am alone, only you can save me." This creates this closed emotional loop. The follower's own identity gets completely tangled up with the leader's survival. And so any attack on the leader feels like an attack on them. It's how a whole population, the source suggests, can become hostages to one person's inner chaos. Which brings us to the final and pretty stark warning from this analysis about where all of this leads. The source makes a powerful claim. Donald Trump isn't the disease, he's the symptom. The real disease, it argues, is a collective one. It's our society's refusal to look at our own shadow, our refusal to face hard truths, to admit our limitations, and to deal with our own fears. And this final quote is just chilling. The darkness does not knock, it takes the keys. The warning here is that when a society chooses illusion over reality, when it props up an unchecked ego as its hero, the fallout isn't just a possibility. According to this analysis, it's inevitable. And that's the really challenging question the source leaves us with. It's not just about him, it's about us. How does a society even begin to face the shadows it refuses to see in itself? A question that asks us to stop looking at a leader and start looking in the mirror. Thanks for joining us for this explainer.